Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about implied or missing premises. You'll sometimes hear these called assumed premises. I don't really like that term. I mean, it's perfectly descriptive. But when we talk about the assumptions of an argument, sometimes perfectly valid arguments can have, pretty big assumptions. They just assume the truth of a premise. Um, so I like to distinguish, implied or missing premises from just assumptions in an argument. And we talked about earlier in the semester, you know, implied premises. And we did a little bit on it, but I kind of shied away from it because it's often hard to know what premises we need to fill in, right? When there are missing premises, which there are in a lot of arguments, how do we know exactly how explicit we need to be, right? And how do we know the best way to fill in premises? I might say, well, remember we talked about the principle of charity earlier in the semester. Well, try to give the person an argument that works. Well, what in the world does that mean, right? You know, and maybe five of us will fill in five different things because we think five different things are what the argument needs to work, right? Now, I actually think the stuff we've learned about validity and formal symbolic logic and ways of, testing for validity with that, I actually think that will help us a bit when it comes to implied or missing premises. Um, because one good way to do this is to look at deductive validity and ask ourselves what we need to plug in to make the argument valid. So look, now obviously, if the argument is an inductive argument, we don't want to do this. But if the argument has a deductive form, well, we can put it in the form of symbolic logic, or we can even just think about it and ask ourselves, well, is it valid as explicitly stated? If it's not, could it be valid if we add a few more premises that the person seems to assume? So your first step in filling in missing premises is to try to give the other person a valid argument. At least if we can plausibly interpret what they're saying as a deductive argument. So look, think about this, right? We'll put this in symbolic form. What are these arguments missing, right? A arrow B, if A then B, not A. What would make this a valid argument, right? Well, obviously this uses modus tollens. Not B, this just seems to assume not B. Adding not B would neatly make this a valid argument, right? Or if A then B, conclusion B, what would make this a valid argument, right? Well, if we add A, right? So the argument seems to assume A. Look, or this one, A or B or C, not B, so A. Well, it's not valid as it's written. What would you need to add to make it valid? Well, multi-step argument by elimination, you'd need to add not C, right? Okay, so look, obviously if we write this in formal form, we can see what we need to add. Well, what about with real written arguments? So here's an example of how this works with a written real argument. This is one I just cribbed from another logic book. Absolute certainty would only be possible if some methods of gaining knowledge were infallible. Infallible meaning, completely free from error. So absolute certainty is not possible. Well, obviously this, if you think about it, this doesn't seem like a valid argument. Even if you don't want to think in terms of validity, there seems to be something missing here. What is it? How do we fill it in? So first, let's distill the argument, put it in this 1, 2, whatever form. Seems to be a premise and a conclusion here. Absolute certainty would only be possible if some methods of gaining knowledge were infallible, so absolute certainty is not possible. What's this argument doing? what is it saying, right? If you think about it, it is, I think, making a claim about a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition for absolute certainty being possible that we have at least one method of gaining knowledge that's infallible. Some, methods is just a way of saying at least one, right? So absolute certainty would only be possible if some methods of gaining knowledge were infallible. Remember, necessary conditions are often a little tricky, but we're saying if no infallible methods, if none exist, then absolute certainty not possible. Not K, arrow, not A. If not K, then not A, right? Absolute certainty is not possible, not A. Well, what do we need to make this a valid argument? It's very clear what we need. We need this not K, right? We need to know the antecedent is true, because if the antecedent is true in a conditional, if we accept the conditional, then the conclusion can't possibly be false. All right, short, artificial, whatever. Here's another example of how we can use this method to fill in missing premises. This one is actually stolen from a Sherlock Holmes novel. Another logic book quotes it. I just, whatever. They can't fault me. They already stole it from Arthur Conan Doyle, so I'll crib it again, right? And now it's funny. I actually like picking on Sherlock Holmes here because, Holmes is famous for, supposedly deduction. Anyway, Holmes often makes these just incredible leaps in logic. I don't know. So it's kind of fun to take one of his arguments apart. So, I don't know. I can't really read this, and I'll read it in my best narrator voice. And now came the great question as to why. Robbery had not been the object of the murder, for nothing was taken. Was it politics, then? Or was it a woman? That was the question that confronted me. I was inclined from the first to the latter supposition. Political assassins are only too glad to do their work on the fly. This murder had, on the contrary, been done most deliberately, and the perpetrator had left his track all over the room, showing that he had been there for the whole time. It must have been a private wrong and not a political one, which called for such methodical revenge. Right? So Holmes is walking us through his logic. Let's look at it. We can distill this. I'm not going to go through all the work, but rephrase this a lot, cut out a lot of verbiage. I think this is more or less Holmes's argument. Robbery was not the motive of the murder. Why? Nothing was taken. So the motive was political or revenge. If the murder was political, the murderer would have acted quickly. This murderer had not acted quickly, so the motive must have been revenge. Now, what are Holmes's implied premises here, right? Let's put this in the form of, we've got it distilled, we've cut out a lot of the verbiage, all the window dressing you put in a detective novel. Let's put it in forms of symbols. I'm not going to give you guys little equals marks. We'll just move somewhat quickly through this, right? Robbery wasn't the motive of the murder, not R. Nothing was taken, not T. So the motive was political or revenge, P or V. If the murder was political, the murderer would have acted quickly. If P, then Q. This murderer had not acted quickly, not V, so it must have been revenge, V. Well, look, what are valid steps here not, right? Well, obviously, 4 and 5, that gives you a valid argument. Not if P, then Q, not Q, well, that gives you not P, right? Well, then we can eliminate P here in 3, and that would leave us V, right? But, why do we eliminate robbery as a motive just because we have not T here? Holmes never explains that. That move doesn't seem clear. And, 3, where he just introduces and says, well, it's political revenge. Why make that assumption? How's that connected with what else goes on here, right? So then we ask ourselves, I think, well, how do we make this a valid argument? How do we make all the steps here valid and not just the ones that already are? So we add a one, premises 1 and 2. We maybe move around some others, right? The motive was either robbery, political, or revenge. R or P or V. If the motive was robbery, then something would have been taken. If R, then T. Nothing was taken, not T. Robbery was not the motive of the murder. So we can eliminate R. We go back to 1 here. That leaves P or V. If the murder was political, the murderer would have acted quickly. If P, then Q. This murderer had not acted quickly, not Q. We can fill it in, so not P. We have our big disjunction to start with. We've eliminated 2 possibilities. That leaves us with revenge, right? Well, now look, what's the advantage of doing this, right? Besides making a little bit of fun of Sherlock Holmes. Well, look, if we see what the assumptions are here, we can ask ourselves, now that we've made this a valid argument, how well do these implied premises, do these assumptions stand up? Is it really true? Should we really accept that the motive had to be robbery, political, or revenge? Are there other possible motives for the murder that Holmes left out, right? I don't remember the novel. I don't know how justifiable this assumption is, but we should ask ourselves, well, do we agree with that, right? Well, we should also ask, if the motive was robbery, would the murderer necessarily have taken something, right? Seems like probably so. By definition, robbery, you want to take something. But, we can ask ourselves here, right? One more example of using valid deductive forms to fill in missing premises. Here is a very simplified version of a libertarian argument. Robert Nozick, famous libertarian philosopher, gives this one. The only justifiable reason to tax citizens is to protect their property and persons, and the persons and property of other citizens. So the only reason to tax citizens, or the only justifiable reason, is to support the military and law enforcement. The only justifiable reason to tax citizens to protect their property and persons, and the persons and property of other citizens. So the only reason to tax citizens is to support the military and law enforcement. So there's already a lot going on with this argument, right? So I think we can, the statements, the sort of facts it's talking about, Rx, X is a justifiable reason to tax citizens, PX, X protects persons, OX, X protects property, MX, X supports the military, LX, X supports law enforcement, right? These are the things that it talks about, right? There's already a lot packed into these 2 premises. Do they get us a valid argument, though, right? So I think number 1 here is saying, this is the best way to read this is, I think, an if and only if statement, right? The author seems to think, well, protecting property is a good reason to, tax citizens, protecting persons is a good reason, but they're the only ones, right? So I think this would say PX or OX if and only if we have our biconditional RX, right? So the only justifiable reason to tax citizens is to support the military and law enforcement, right? Best way to read this is as a necessary condition. So I think we'd read this as, not MX or LX. This doesn't, it's a tax that doesn't support the military or law enforcement. Then, RX, not RX, it's not a good reason to tax citizens. What's missing here, right? Well, I think we can actually make this a valid argument by adding just one more premise, right? And that premise would be something like, the only taxes that protect persons or property are those that support the military or police. Not MX or RX supports the military law enforcement, then not PX and not OX, right? It doesn't do one of these things, then it doesn't protect property and it doesn't protect persons, it doesn't protect property. So premise 3, this one isn't a missing premise. This is just something that we can help ourselves from 1. Remember, when we have this biconditional, it basically says, PX or OX, biconditional arrow RX. That just means PX or OX. If PX or OX, then RX, you get that one arrow statement. It also means RX, arrow, PX or OX. So we can just help ourselves to part of that. This is part of what 1 already means, just breaking it down. If RX, then PX or OX. Well, we just look at modus tollens or, the contrapositive. Not PX or OX, then not RX, right? So the only justifiable reason to tax citizens is to support the military and law enforcement. Now, a libertarian who run this argument like Nozick, now once he has this conclusion, he'd plug all sorts of other stuff into the X here and show that it's not supposed to be a good reason to tax people, right? Well, here's my question. Is this, we've made this a valid argument. I probably should add a few more steps here to make the logic clear, but, if you want to, you can. But we can ask ourselves, do we buy this assumed premise, right? This missing premise. And now look, if I said, what does this argument assume? It already assumes a lot of stuff. These are the only justifiable reasons to tax citizens. But what I'm talking about now is what premise is missing? What do we need to add to make it valid? And when we fill in this premise that we need to make it valid, we can already see that there are reasons to doubt this premise, right? Maybe there are other things that protect persons and property besides the military and the police, right? The Environmental Protection Agency certainly seems like it protects people's property. If someone dumps poison in the river 20 miles up from you and you have some riverfront property and suddenly it smells like paint thinner and you can't dip your toe in it, it seems to harm your property, right? Something really appropriate currently, if someone gives you a terrible disease that harms your person, it seems like money that we pay to the CDC or things like that might also protect our persons. That's not the military or police, right? So, once we know what we need to make this a valid argument, we can move on to seeing whether we accept those assumptions now that we have them out there. Okay, so hopefully this idea of missing premises and how the stuff we've learned about deductive arguments and valid forms of argument can help us fill it in. Hopefully that all makes sense to you guys. I have a few short exercises posted just to kind of drive the idea home a bit more.